Depending on who you ask, the advent of globalization was either the death knell for our world or a shift toward unprecedented levels of equity. Of course, the more you talk to that person, the more you'll discover that their opinions on globalization are heavily influenced by their own social, political, and economic views. That's why many experts find it very telling when people claim that globalization is over. As you'll see in this video, globalization is very much here to stay, though it may take on a new appearance. If you're watching this, you're likely benefiting from globalization in multiple ways. The laptop, phone, or tablet you're looking at right now is a good starting point, but it would take hours to point out all the ways this single concept has changed and will continue to change your life. The term globalization refers to increased interconnectedness and interdependence between countries, economies, and cultures. Though it has changed dramatically over the years, it is nonetheless the foundation for exchanging ideas, goods, services, and information. As a result of this exchange, globalization has facilitated numerous advancements in technology, communication, transportation, and more. Before discussing whether or not globalization is over or merely adapting to a changing world, it's important to talk about where globalization comes from. Because while both detractors and supporters consider it to be somewhat of a new phenomenon, you can actually trace its roots back centuries. Meanwhile, the ideas it's based on trace back millennia. In fact, people traded across borders often in the early centuries. All that really limited them was their ability to travel, not their willingness to interact with one another. You see, the concept of trade is rather simple. One person has goods and another person needs them. However, in order to get the goods from the first person, that second person has to offer them something of equal worth. In the days when commodities consisted of food and furs, this wasn't that hard. As products and services became more complex, money became a way to represent and transfer value when bartering wasn't ideal. Still, it wasn't until the Middle Ages that things kicked into high gear. As feudalism declined, merchants and entrepreneurs sought to accumulate wealth through trade and commerce. This led directly into what we call the Age of Exploration and, unfortunately, colonialism. Indeed, the 15th and 16th centuries were a period of intense exploration as European powers sought to find new sources of wealth in Asia, Africa, and the New World. A few centuries later came the Industrial Revolution, which saw the spread of new technologies all around the globe. In the 19th century, the world saw the rise of joint stock companies, free trade, laissez-faire economy, and capitalist market, which laid the ground for a modernized, industrialized, and interconnected world. By the 20th century, economists were already calling for the removal of international trade barriers, which tended to be bogged down by tariffs and other restrictions. Railroads, communication, and air travel provided infrastructure for these new endeavors, and before long, products were moving across borders as quickly as ideas. There's no denying that all of this falls under the definition of increased interconnectedness and interdependence between countries, economies, and cultures. Like it or not, this was a form of globalization, even if the term itself did not gain widespread use until after 1945. After all, both World War I and World War II were the direct result of globalization efforts. Many of the treaties and agreements that pulled nations thousands of miles away into the Europe-based conflict were originally made for political and economic purposes. Still, the main reason why World War II is often seen as the turning point for globalization is that virtually all of the world's major industrial powers, save the United States, were demolished by the fighting. It was also during World War II that the IMF, or International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank first appeared. As the superpowers rushed to rebuild, new supply chains, multinational corporations, and trade partnerships emerged to facilitate their revitalization. Globalization as we know it had arrived. It's important to note that there were two main trading blocks at work during this time. On the one hand, you had capitalist countries looking to benefit from one another while also benefiting from underdeveloped nations in the global south. Simultaneously, you had communist countries like the USSR and East Germany doing their best to compete along the same lines while avoiding becoming reliant on their capitalist rivals. And though the Cold War hampered globalization in many ways, it also facilitated U.S. President Richard Nixon's visit to China. This eventually led to a trade agreement in 1979 despite the fact that China was and remains a communist country. Of course, this relationship, more than any other, would serve to inflame both supporters and critics of this new, modernized globalization. Since the 1980s, globalization has been increasingly typified by integration of national economies through trade, investment, and technology. Advances in transportation and communication have made it even easier to coordinate the movement of goods and information, thus accelerating the process. However, this is also when the cracks in the system began to appear. More and more companies began offshoring and outsourcing jobs to boost company profits, which led to thousands of factories and manufacturing plants closing across the West. Over time, cheap labor and cheap goods became integral to the business models of some of the richest companies in the world, including Walmart, Apple, and Ford. And while there are arguments that offshoring actually benefits the US more than previously thought, many globalization critics couldn't see past the shuttered factory doors and lengthening unemployment lines. The Cold War effectively ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. However, it did not change the United States' policy toward non-capitalist countries, former or otherwise. Historically, the US has treated traditional allies such as South Korea, Japan, and Europe very differently from nations like China or Russia. Because of their shared values, the US has comprehensive trade and security agreements with most of its geopolitical friends. These generally aim to promote liberalized trade, eliminate trade barriers, and foster mutual economic growth while shielding US allies from armed assaults. However, the US tends to take a much harder line when dealing with Russia and China. They are not traditional US allies, nor are their values aligned with the US. Basically, US relations with these non-US allies are only characterized by trade relations, which are usually the most fragile ones. The Western Bloc once made an effort to transform China and Russia into one of their democratic allies. Back in 2000, US President Bill Clinton made a speech to persuade US lawmakers to pass a bill allowing PRC's entry into the World Trade Organization, in the hopes that China will become a member of the democratic world after some economic progress. The Europeans, who believed Russia would soon experience democratization, once adopted a Russia-friendly policy and called for closer economic partnership with the country. However, the reality was a slap in their faces. The dark truth was, none of them became their democratic allies, and economic relations without alignment of values were unsustainable. This is where the China hawk stepped in. As the US grew weary of China's rising power and increasingly authoritarian policies at home, it decided to shift to a containment policy. As a result, US-China relations have spiraled downward since 2018. The same happened to Russia when it invaded Ukraine in 2022. Now, the US and its allies decided to put an end to their romantic relationship with Chinese cheap labor and Russian energy. Western operations in China have been scaled back, reducing their reliance on Chinese supplies. The Europeans have stopped trading with Russia and imposed heavy sanctions on the country since February 2022 in an attempt to show solidarity with Ukraine. With the ongoing events, we can easily confirm that the progress of globalization that began in 1990 has been reversed. We're returning to the times where nations place a larger focus on regional affairs and establish relations based on values and ideology. Bad feelings aside, China remains the United States' largest goods trading partner. In 2021, 17.9% of total U.S. imports, amounting to $2.8 trillion, were imported from China. However, recently there have been calls on both sides for what economists refer to as decoupling. This is a deliberate economic disengagement and reduced interdependence between two countries with regard to trade, technology, finance, and supply chains. The potential decoupling of one of history's largest, most profitable, and most generative trade partnerships is a big reason why many claim that globalization is over. And it's true that the world has seen an uptick in protectionist policies in recent years, as well as a retreat from multilateralism toward intra-border idealism. There has also been more regional cooperation, with countries again forming pacts and blocs similar to the days of the World Wars. But it's important to remember that globalization is not a new phenomenon. As discussed earlier, the concept of cross-border trade and cooperation is nearly as old as the borders themselves. Globalization has always shifted and changed alongside new technology and new geopolitical events. It's entirely possible that that's what we're seeing right now. True, globalization as we knew it may be going away, but we're all too interconnected. And more importantly, too dependent on those connections to let them simply go away. Instead of turning away from globalization, the world is only experiencing the transformation from the globalization of strangers to the globalization of friends. But how do they differ? Let me put it in a simple way. On one hand, you exchange valuable items of significance with your close friends. On the other hand, you buy some goods, which aren't very important, from a hawker who you aren't familiar with. It's like navigating a marketplace where you cherish the trust and familiarity with your friends, conducting meaningful trades while relying on more impersonal transactions with strangers for less essential items. It's not a difficult task to predict what would happen in the next 10 to 20 years with our previous analysis. The Western Bloc would largely reduce their strategic dependence on China and Russia. In the past 5 years, we have seen US's efforts to exclude China from the international supply chain of crucial technology like 5G and advanced semiconductors. The EU has also strived to wean off energy dependence from Russia. However, it's too simplistic to draw the conclusion that we will no longer trade with China and Russia. That said, the US and its allies are reducing their strategic reliance on authoritarian regimes, but they would likely still maintain trade relations with China and Russia. For the proof of this, look no further than the infamous US export restrictions imposed on China in 2022. The recently implemented export controls primarily target the forefront of semiconductor manufacturing and design, aiming to curtail the rapid advancement of China's technological advantage in this field. While these controls have proven effective in slowing down China's progress in the most advanced semiconductor technology, they have limited impact on China's ability to produce older, yet still widely utilized, legacy chips. These chips remain in high demand across various sectors, including automobiles, renewable technology, and consumer electronics. The fact that the US refrained from sanctioning China at full scale indicates that it'll still likely trade with the People's Republic on less strategic terms. Besides trade, it's almost impossible to exclude China in the global fight against climate change. As one of the most populous nations in the world, China will play a vital role in reducing carbon emission and the development of new energy industries. While Western leaders have been outspoken critics of PRC's human rights abuses and its efforts to challenge the current international order, they have signaled their support for more cooperation with China on sustainable development. Undeniably, given its gigantic size and population, we'll never live in a green world without a green China. All in all, it is evident that globalization is not coming to an end, but rather undergoing a significant transformation. While there may be challenges and tensions arising from US-China decoupling, it is crucial to recognize that globalization remains a driving force in our interconnected world. Thanks for sticking till the end. Feel free to sound off in the comments, and please like if you found this presentation informative. See you next time.